Chapter 23 of the Return of Dr. Fu-Manchu. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elaine Tweddle. The Return of Dr. Fu-Manchu by Sax Rohmer. Chapter 23 A Cry on the Moor. Of the events intervening between this moment and that when death called to us out of the night, I have the haziest recollections. An excellent dinner was served in the bleak and gloomy dining room by the mulatto, and the crippled author was carried to the head of the table by this same herculean attendant as lightly as though he had but the weight of a child. Van Roon talked continuously, revealing a deep knowledge of all sorts of obscure matters, and in the brief intervals Nayland Smith talked also with almost feverish rapidity. Plans for the future were discussed. I can recall no one of them. I could not stifle my queer sentiments in regard to the mulatto, and every time I found him behind my chair I was hard put to repress a shudder. In this fashion the strange evening passed, and to the accompaniment of distant, muttering thunder, we two guests retired to our chambers in Cragmire Tower. Smith had contrived to give me my instructions in a whisper, and 5 minutes after entering my own room I had snuffed the candles, slipped a wedge which he had given me under the door, crept out through the window onto the guttered ledge, and joined Smith in his room. He, too, had extinguished his candles, and the place was in darkness. As I climbed in, he grasped my wrist to silence me, and turned me forcibly toward the window. "Listen," he said. I turned and looked out upon a prospect which had been a fit setting for the witch scene in Macbeth. Thunderclouds hung low over the moor, but through them ran a sort of chasm or rift, allowing a bar of lurid light to stretch across the drear, from east to west, a sort of lane walled by darkness. There came a remote murmuring as of a troubled sea, a hushed and distant chorus, and sometimes in upon it broke the drums of heaven. In the west lightning flickered, though but faintly, intermittently. Then came the call. Out of the blackness of the moor it came, wild and distant. "Help! Help!" "Smith!" I whispered. "What is it? What..." "Mr. Smith!" came the agonized cry. "Nayland Smith! Help! For God's sake..." "Quick, Smith!" I cried. "Quick, man! It's Van Roon! He's been dragged out! They are murdering him!" Nayland Smith held me in a vice-like grip, silent, unmoved. Louder and more agonized came the cry for aid, and I became more than ever certain that it was poor Van Roon who uttered it. "Mr. Smith! Dr. Petrie! For God's sake come, or it will be too late!" "Smith!" I said, turning furiously upon my friend, "if you are going to remain here whilst murder is done, I am not." My blood boiled now with hot resentment. It was incredible, inhuman, that we should remain there inert, whilst a fellow man, and our host to boot, was being done to death out there in the darkness. I exerted all my strength to break away, but although my efforts told upon him, as his loud breathing revealed, Nayland Smith clung to me tenaciously. Had my hands been free, in my fury I could have struck him, for the pitiable cries, growing fainter, now told their own tale. Then Smith spoke, shortly and angrily, breathing hard between the words. "Be quiet, you fool!" he snapped. "It's little less than an insult, Petrie, to think me capable of refusing help where help is needed." Like a cold douche his words acted. In that instant I knew myself a fool. "You remember the call of Siva?" he said, thrusting me away irritably. "2 years ago, and what it meant to those who obeyed it?" "You might have told me..." "Told you? You would have been through the window before I'd uttered 2 words." I realized the truth of his assertion, and the justness of his anger. "Forgive me, old man," I said, very crestfallen, "and my impulse was a natural one, you'll admit. You must remember that I've been trained never to refuse aid when aid is asked." "Shut up, Petrie!" he growled. "Forget it." The cries had ceased now entirely, and a peal of thunder, louder than any yet, echoed over distant Sedgemoor. A chasm of light splitting the heavens closed in, leaving the night wholly black. "Don't talk!" rapped Smith. "Act! You wedged your door?" "Yes." "Good. Get into that cupboard, have your Browning ready, and keep the door very slightly ajar." He was in that mood of repressed fever which I knew, and which always communicated itself to me. I spoke no further word, but stepped into the wardrobe indicated, and drew the door nearly shut. The recess just accommodated me, and through the aperture I could see the bed, vaguely, the open window and part of the opposite wall. I saw Smith cross the floor as a mighty clap of thunder boomed over the house. A gleam of lightning flickered through the gloom. I saw the bed for a moment, distinctly, and it appeared to me that Smith lay therein, with the sheets pulled up over his head. The light was gone, and I could hear big drops of rain pattering upon the leaden gutter below the open window. My mood was strange, detached, and characterized by vagueness. That Van Roon lay dead upon the moor I was convinced, and, although I recognized that it must be a sufficient one, I could not even dimly divine the reason why we had refrained from lending him aid. To have failed to save him, knowing his peril, would have been bad enough; to have refused, I thought, was shameful. Better to have shared his fate. Yet... The downpour was increasing, and beating now a regular tattoo upon the gutterway. Then, splitting the oblong of greater blackness which marked the casement, quivered dazzlingly another flash of lightning, in which I saw the bed again, with that impression of Smith curled up in it. The blinding light died out. Came the crash of thunder, harsh and fearsome, more imminently above the tower than ever. The building seemed to shake. Coming as they did, horror and the wrath of Heaven together, suddenly, crashingly, black and angry after the fairness of the day, these happenings and their settings must have terrorized the stoutest heart. But somehow I seemed detached, as I have said, and set apart from the whirl of events, a spectator. Even when a vague yellow light crept across the room from the direction of the door, and flickered unsteadily on the bed, I remained unmoved to a certain degree, although passively alive to the significance of the incident. I realized that the ultimate issue was at hand, but either because I was emotionally exhausted, or from some other cause, the pending climax failed to disturb me. Going on tiptoe, in stockinged feet, across my field of vision, past Kegan Van Roon! He was in his shirt sleeves, and held a lighted candle in one hand, whilst with the other he shaded it against the draught from the window. He was a cripple no longer, and the smoked glasses were discarded. Most of the light, at the moment when I first saw him, shone upon his thin olive face, and at sight of his eyes much of the mystery of Cragmire Tower was resolved. For they were oblique, very slightly, but nevertheless unmistakably oblique. Though highly educated, and possibly an American citizen, Van Roon was a Chinaman. Upon the picture of his face as I saw it then I do not care to dwell. It lacked the unique horror of Dr. Fu-Manchu's unforgettable countenance, but possessed a sort of animal malignancy which the latter lacked. He approached within 3 or 4 feet of the bed, peering, peering; then, with a timidity which spoke well for Nayland Smith's reputation, paused and beckoned to some one who evidently stood in the doorway behind him. As he did so, I noted that the legs of his trousers were caked with greenish brown mud nearly up to the knees. The huge mulatto, silent footed, crossed to the bed in 3 strides. He was stripped to the waist, and excepting some few professional athletes, I had never seen a torso to compare with that which, brown and glistening, now bent over Nayland Smith. The muscular development was simply enormous; the man had a neck like a column, and the thews around his back and shoulders were like ivy tentacles wreathing some gnarled oak. Whilst Van Roon, his evil gaze upon the bed, held the candle aloft, the mulatto, with a curious preparatory writhing movement of the mighty shoulders, lowered his outstretched fingers to the disordered bed linen. I pushed open the cupboard door and thrust out the Browning. As I did so, a dramatic thing happened. A tall, gaunt figure shot suddenly upright from the bed. It was Nayland Smith. Upraised in his hand he held a heavy walking cane. I knew the handle to be leaded, and I could judge of the force with which he wielded it by the fact that it cut the air with a keen, swishing sound. It descended upon the back of the mulatto's skull with a sickening thud, and the great brown body dropped inert upon the padded bed, in which not Smith but his grip reposed. There was no word, no cry. Then "Shoot, Petrie! Shoot the fiend! Shoot!" Van Roon, dropping the candle in the falling gleam